In this video, we'll discuss the John Adams presidency as the second president of the United States. Alexander Hamilton was the best-known member of the Federalist Party, but now that Washington had left after 2 terms, Hamilton's financial policies had made him very unpopular. The Federalists were forced to turn to Washington's Vice President, John Adams, as their nominee, and the Democratic Republicans naturally supported Thomas Jefferson. Political passions ran feverishly high in the presidential campaign of 1796. The issues of the campaign focused heavily on personalities. Jeffersonians, again assaulting the too forceful crushing of the Whiskey Rebellion by the Federalists, and the John Jay Treaty, which they did not support. John Adams, with the most of his support in New England, was able to win the presidency by acquiring 71 electoral votes. Thomas Jefferson becomes vice president by winning 68 electoral votes. Back during this time period, the way that the president and the vice president were elected is the person who got the most electoral votes became president, and the person who got the second most electoral votes became vice president, regardless of their political party. And so it's in this way that John Adams, a Federalist, becomes President of the United States, and Thomas Jefferson, a Democratic Republican, becomes Vice President. John Adams was a man of stern principles who did his duty with stubborn devotion, but he was sometimes tactless and viewed as an intellectual aristocrat and did not appeal to the common people. He also suffered from other handicaps. He had to fill Washington's shoes, which was going to be a very difficult thing to do. He was hated by Alexander Hamilton, who tried to undermine him, and who had resigned from the Treasury in 1795 and was now leading the faction of the Federalist Party called the High Federalists. Alexander Hamilton even secretly plotted with other members of John Adams's cabinet against the president, who had a conspiracy rather than a cabinet on his hands. And most ominous of all, Adams inherited the issues that the United States was having with France. The French were infuriated by Jay's treaty and condemned it as a step towards an alliance with Great Britain, and they assailed the pact as a violation of the Franco-American Treaty of 1778. French warships, in retaliation, began to seize defenseless American merchant vessels. The Paris regime haughtily refused to receive America's newly appointed envoy to France. True to Washington's policy of steering clear of war at all costs, Adams tried again to reach an agreement with the French and appointed a diplomatic commission of 3 men, including John Marshall, who would be the future Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, to go to France. Adams' envoys, reaching Paris in 1797, hoped to meet with their Prime Minister Talleyrand, but they were secretly approached by 3 go-betweens who were never formally named but only referred to as X, Y, and Z, who demanded an unneutral loan of $250,000 to talk with the French Prime Minister, Talleyrand. Embattled France, its hands full in Europe, did not want war with America, and Talleyrand did realize that to fight the United States would merely add another enemy to the roster. And the British, who were lending the Americans cannons and other war supplies, were going to be driven closer to their wayward cousins than they were to be again. Talleyrand let it be known through roundabout channels that if the Americans would send a new minister, they would be received with proper respect. This French furor brought Adams a degree of personal acclaim he had never known. Adams perceived that a full-fledged war, crowned by the conquest of Florida and Louisiana, would bring new applause to the Federalist Party. He realized full well that war must be avoided, though, while the country was relatively weak. The terms of Talleyrand's proposal were intolerable. The American trio knew that bribes were standard diplomatic devices in Europe, but they gagged at $250,000 just to talk to Talleyrand. Negotiations quickly broke down, and John Marshall was hailed as a conquering hero. War hysteria sweeps through the United States, catching even President Adams up in its grasp. The Federalists were delighted at this unexpected turn of affairs, whereas the Jeffersonians hung their heads in shame over the misbehavior of their French friends who they supported. War preparations in the United States were pushed along at a feverish pace, despite considerable Jeffersonian opposition in Congress. Adams creates the Navy Department, and he's known as the father of the American Navy. And the three-ship Navy is expanded. The United States Marine Corps is also reestablished. Bloodshed was confined to the sea, and principally the West Indies. And in 2.5 years of undeclared hostilities, American privateers and men of many in the new Navy supported over 80 armed vessels flying the French colors. Only a slight push might plunge both nations into a full-scale war. Adams, in early 1799, submitted to the Senate the new minister to France. Although Hamilton and his faction were enraged, political opinion was favorable to one last try for peace. America's envoys found the political skies brightening when they reached Paris in early 1800. The ambitious Little Corporal, the Corsican Napoleon Bonaparte, had recently seized dictatorial power. He was eager to free his hands of the American squabble. The afflictions and ambitions of the Old World were again working to America's advantage. After a great deal of haggling, a memorial treaty known as the Convention of 1800 was signed in Paris. France agreed to annul the 22-year-old alliance, but as a kind of alimony, the United States agreed to pay the damages and claims of American shippers. John Adams deserves immense credit for his belated push for peace, even though he was moved in part by the jealousy of Hamilton. Adams not only avoided the hazards of war, but unwittingly smoothed the path for the peaceful purchase of Louisiana 3 years later. President Adams, the bubble of his popularity pricked by peace, was aware of his signal contribution to the nation, and he knew that he had helped preserve peace with France. Even though the American people and history would not seem to give John Adams a very positive light for his presidency, and we'll discuss that more in class.